Subscribe and leave a comment saying I subscribed, and I will personally reply to your comment.
Late nights in a hospital have their own brand of quiet. A fragile silence broken only by the distant hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses moving through the halls. That night, though, the stillness seemed heavier, as though something unseen pressed down on the air. We were all on edge, exhaustion hanging on our shoulders like an invisible weight. So when the charge nurse's page came through, short, sharp, and urgent, it jarred us into action. There was no detail, only the word emergency. I instinctively looked for my partner, Claire, but she wasn't in sight. I assumed she'd stepped out for a quick break, maybe to refill the crash carts in the supply closet. I glanced over to the charge nurse, who, with a tense sigh, pulled up the security cameras to locate her. She clicked through the various angles, stopping suddenly on operating room 6. The image on the screen was eerie. The room lay mostly in shadow, its main lights off except for a dull spill from the hallway that crept in and cast long shadows over the empty chairs and medical equipment. But it wasn't entirely empty. There, seated at the nurse's desk, was a figure. Claire, I thought, relieved, but also annoyed. She was seated with her legs crossed, foot bobbing up and down, as though completely oblivious to the rest of us waiting. Her face was turned away from the camera, hidden in shadow, which made her stillness seem almost unnatural. The charge nurse grumbled under her breath, reaching for the desk phone. As it rang, we watched on the screen as the figure's head turned ever so slightly, just enough to acknowledge the ringing, but she didn't pick up. The only movement was her crossed leg, still bouncing up and down with the same rhythmic, slow pace, almost like she couldn't hear us at all. "Enough games," the charge nurse muttered, waving me forward. "Go drag her back here if she's going to mess around." I nodded, heading down the quiet, dimly lit hallway toward the darkened OR. I fully expected Claire to be sitting there, grinning, waiting to startle me. But when I pushed open the door and flicked on the lights, the room was empty. Every chair, every piece of equipment was in its place, bathed in the sterile white glow of the fluorescents. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. Confused, I left the room, checking the surrounding hallways. Nothing. Claire was nowhere to be found. I returned to the front desk, the confusion on my face telling them everything. "The room was empty," I said, hearing the faint tremor in my own voice. The charge nurse pulled her gaze from mine, her eyes narrowing as she glanced back at the security feed. And there it was, unmistakable on the screen. The figure at the desk, legs still crossed, foot bouncing in that same deliberate rhythm. We all stared, and a silent, creeping dread settled over us. It was then that we heard footsteps echoing down the hall. I whipped around just in time to see Claire approaching us from the opposite end of the suite, her expression casual, a box of supplies tucked under her arm. "I was in the storage closet," she said, looking at us, clearly confused by our wide-eyed silence. "What's going on?" No one spoke, but we all looked back at the camera feed. The figure was gone. The desk chair in the OR sat vacant, the room as empty and pristine as if no one had ever set foot in it. I felt the chill of realization spread through me, raising goosebumps along my arms. The charge nurse cleared her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. I think we should move the emergency case to another OR." No one argued. We gathered our things, staying in a tight, silent group as we moved down the hall, away from OR 6. The following morning, when the night shift was over, we shared the experience with the day crew. A couple of veteran nurses listened, nodding with grim expressions that told us they knew something we didn't. One finally spoke, her voice soft and reverent. "There was a nurse," she said, her eyes unfocused as though recalling a memory. "Decades ago. She passed away during her own emergency surgery. It was tragic. She was well loved. Some say she never left." Another nodded, adding, "Some of us, we believe she's still helping, in her own way. Tools show up when you need them most. Supplies that no one remembers stocking suddenly appear. It's her, I think, watching out for us." The air was thick with unease, The idea of her lingering, watching, waiting, it gnawed at something deep in me. I glanced down the hall, half expecting to catch a shadow moving just beyond the door to OR6. When I thought of her, I didn't feel comforted. Instead, I felt an icy sadness, a whispering loneliness that seemed to seep from the walls of that silent, dim room. I couldn't shake the feeling that in death, she'd been bound to that OR, endlessly pacing the night shift, trapped in a loop of duty that would never end. For the rest of my time at that hospital, I avoided OR6. But on some nights, when I passed it, I swear I'd see the faint shadow of someone sitting at that desk, a leg gently bobbing up and down, her face hidden from view, waiting, still there, nursing, even in death. I used to work late nights at a bowling alley. Closing alone could feel eerie, but I was used to it, or so I thought. One Tuesday night, I finished my routine, flicking off each row of lights and listening to the silence grow. I could still smell the faint smoke from the guy who tried to sneak a cigarette in the bathroom. The place was deserted, and as I locked up the register, I mentally ran through my checklist. All clear, no lingering customers, lights off, everything done. But then, just as I reached for my keys, something happened that made my stomach drop. With a loud hum, Lane 6 turned on. Now, these lanes didn't just turn on at random. There was a master switch in the back, and only the lane lights worked on an automated system. But Lane 6 wasn't just any lane. I had been here long enough to hear the stories. A regular who'd come every week had passed away suddenly mid-frame on Lane 6 years ago. Even my boss joked that it was haunted, that it would act up sometimes, but no one took it seriously. Until now. The lane lights glowed in the darkness, illuminating the pins, each one casting a shadow across the alley floor. The light was somehow too bright, almost painfully white against the dark, like a spotlight at the end of a tunnel. I felt a prickling unease crawl up my spine, but shook it off. This place had wiring issues. The building was ancient. There had to be a logical explanation, right? Just in case, I flicked on the lights over the lanes and walked toward the back, where the switch was. As I neared Lane 6, a strange sound filled the alley, a slow, rhythmic rolling. It was the sound of a bowling ball thudding down the lane, except I hadn't seen a ball roll. I hadn't touched anything. I froze, looking at the pins at the end of Lane 6. They seemed undisturbed, still perfectly aligned. But then, one by one, the pins started toppling, each one falling as if knocked down by an invisible hand. There was no ball, just the pins, tumbling in eerie slow motion. I felt my breath hitch. "Hello?" My voice echoed, weak and hollow in the empty space. There was no response, just the persistent hum of the lights, brighter than ever. I forced myself to keep moving, edging my way toward the curtain that led to the back switch panel. Then, just as I was about to reach out and push the curtain aside, the lane light cut off. I stumbled back, my pulse thundering in my ears. Lane 6 was dark again, as if nothing had happened. I blinked, heart racing, half expecting the lights to flicker back on, the pins to reset. Something, anything, to explain what I'd just seen. But there was nothing, just silence, like before. I wanted to check the switch panel, to prove to myself that maybe something was wrong with the wiring. But the thought of stepping behind that curtain, into the back area where no light reached, filled me with dread. I left that night without turning back. I was supposed to check everything before leaving, but I didn't care. I locked the door, sped to my car, and drove off, hoping to leave the memory of that night behind. The next morning, my boss was waiting for me. He looked irritated, his arms crossed over his chest. "Look," he said, "if you're gonna leave pins down in a lane, at least let us know. We had to set up Lane 6 again this morning. And what were you thinking, leaving the lane switch on?" I told him everything, every detail. He just stared, a smirk barely concealing his disbelief. "I told you Lane 6 has a reputation, but you're telling me it knocked the pins down on its own? Come on, you're better than that." He didn't believe me. And to be honest, I couldn't blame him. The next few nights I worked, I made a point to avoid looking too closely at Lane 6. I I didn't want to know if it would happen again. But every time I walked past, I swore I heard it. A soft hum, an echo of pins dropping, or the faintest roll of a ball that never seemed to reach the end of the lane. I never stayed late again, and if I could change one thing about that night, it wouldn't be my boss believing me. It would be a camera, something to prove that what I saw was real. Because whatever happened on Lane 6 that night, whatever lingers there in the shadows of the alley, I don't think it's gone. My first night working overtime in the prison's D block was one I'll never forget. Most people dread the overnight shifts, especially in that unit, but I shrugged it off. I'd heard the rumors, of course. D block had been a place of violence and despair, where the walls seemed to soak up death. But I wasn't superstitious. I was new and just wanted to keep my head down and do my job. That night, the clock struck 2 a.m., and I was due for my count. The halls were eerily quiet. The offenders were supposed to be in their cells, though in this medium security block, they had night access to a communal bathroom. As I made my rounds, I heard the unmistakable creak of footsteps coming from the upper level. I glanced up and saw a man descending the stairs, his form shadowed but distinct, tall, painfully skinny, and moving with an almost unsettling smoothness. His long, matted dreads swayed as he walked, giving his silhouette an oddly disjointed appearance in the dim light. As he reached the bathroom door, I called out, "Hey, what's your cell number?" My voice echoed down the hall, but he didn't respond. He just walked into the bathroom and let the door swing shut behind him. Annoyed, I strode over to the bathroom, stopping just outside the door. "Come on, I need to know your cell number," I called. Silence. The sound of my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud as I waited. No answer, not even a shuffle. Frustrated, I decided to go in and handle it directly. The bathroom was small, sterile. I pushed open the door, and the faint scent of bleach mixed with urine hit me. A quick check of the stalls and sinks revealed nothing. No one. I even checked under the stalls, thinking he might be hiding just to mess with the new guy. But the place was completely empty. A chill prickled down my spine. I was certain I had seen him enter. And yet, nothing. I finished my count as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I recorded the numbers. As soon as I was back in the office, I mentioned what had happened to one of the night shift veterans, Officer Jones. His face went pale the moment I mentioned the man on the stairs. "Was he tall?" he asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "Tall and skinny, with long dreads?" I nodded, feeling a knot of unease coil in my stomach. "Yeah, exactly. Who was he?" Jones sighed, running a hand over his face, clearly reluctant to answer. Finally, he leaned in close, his eyes darting around as if afraid someone, or something, might be listening. "That's Mr. Bones. Used to be an inmate in this unit years ago. Real quiet guy, troubled. He took his own life in that bathroom, hung himself with a sheet from the pipes. It was a mess to clean up. But since then, he's been seen by more than one guard. Never says anything, just walks the halls or goes to the bathroom. Always vanishes if you follow him. You aren't the first to see him, and you won't be the last." I stared at Jones, dumbfounded. But the look in his eyes told me he believed every word, and I could still see the man's silhouette in my mind, as clear as if he'd been right there in front of me. I went back to my shift. That night I heard things. Faint footsteps on empty stairwells, whispers from the bathroom when no one was there. Every night since, I've kept my eye on the upper level stairs, wondering if I might see him again.
Subscribe and leave a comment saying "I subscribed," and I will personally reply to your comment.
If you would like to hear more stories and support this channel, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching.